Every Sunday for 10 years, a little boy named Leo brought me flowers. It started when he was just 8 years old, a small child with a gap-toothed smile and eyes the color of the summer sky, clutching a fistful of daisies he'd picked from the meadow behind our houses. He would ring my doorbell, his small face beaming with pride, and present them to me as if they were the rarest orchids in the world. "These are for you, Mrs. Gable," he'd say, and my heart would melt just a little bit more each time. I was a widow, you see. My husband, Robert, had passed away suddenly a year before Leo and his family moved in next door, leaving a silence in my house that was so vast and so loud it often felt like I was drowning in it. The flowers and the sweet boy who brought them became my lifeline. They were a small, weekly promise that I was not entirely alone, that there was still some beauty left in the world for me to see. I thought it was the purest, most innocent gesture I had ever known. I never imagined those flowers were a kind of currency, a down payment on a debt I never knew existed. I never imagined that each bright petal was a marker in a 10-year-long game, a game whose final, devastating move was about to cost me my home, my peace, and the last vestiges of my faith in human kindness. The whole thing unraveled on a Tuesday, the kind of gray, drizzly day that mirrors the gloom in your own heart. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at a letter from the bank. The words were cold and sharp, a jumble of legal terms like foreclosure, default, and immediate action required. Robert, it turned out, had taken out a second mortgage on our home years ago, a secret he had carried to his grave. I had been making the payments faithfully, believing it was the only mortgage we had. But a recent audit by the bank had uncovered the original, much larger loan, and the arrears had ballooned into an impossible sum. They wanted $50,000 in 60 days, or the house I had lived in for 40 years, the house Robert and I had built together from the ground up, would be sold at auction. $50,000. I might as well have been trying to reach the moon on a paper ladder. My pension was just enough to live on, with a little left over for my garden. My savings had been eaten away by the endless repairs an old house demands. I was 72 years old and I was about to become homeless. My first instinct was to call my sister, but she was in a nursing home 3 states away, battling her own demons. I had no children, no one to turn to, except, I thought, for Leo's parents, Sarah and Tom. Over the decade they had been my neighbors, we had developed a quiet, comfortable friendship. They were good people, I thought, hardworking, honest. Tom was a carpenter and Sarah worked part-time at the local library. They often told me how much they appreciated me looking out for Leo, how I was like the grandmother he never had. So with the terrifying letter clutched in my trembling hand, I walked the few steps across the lawn that separated our homes and knocked on their door. Sarah opened it, her face breaking into a warm smile when she saw me. "Evelyn, what a nice surprise. Come in out of this miserable weather." I stepped inside their small, tidy living room. Tom was sitting in his armchair, reading the paper. He stood up when he saw me, his expression one of gentle concern. "Evelyn, you look pale. Is everything all right?" I couldn't hold it in. The tears I had been fighting all morning finally broke free, and the whole sorry story came tumbling out. The secret loan, the impossible sum, the threat of losing my home. I showed them the letter, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. Sarah read it first, her brow furrowed. Then she passed it to Tom. I watched his face as he scanned the page, expecting to see shock, sympathy, maybe even outrage on my behalf. Instead, I saw something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. It was a flicker of calculation. He and Sarah exchanged a look, a silent conversation that passed between them in a fraction of a second. It made a cold knot of unease form in my stomach. "Oh, Evelyn, this is just terrible," Sarah said, pulling me into a hug, but the embrace felt stiff, perfunctory. "You must be sick with worry." "We'll help you," Tom said, his voice a little too firm, a little too quick. "Don't you worry about a thing, we'll figure something out." His certainty felt strained. They lived a modest life. I knew they struggled with their own bills. How could they possibly help me with a $50,000 problem? "That's very kind of you, Tom, but I don't see how," I said, wiping my eyes. "It's an impossible amount of money." "Nothing is impossible when friends help each other," Tom replied, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. Sarah and I will talk tonight. We'll look at our finances. We have some savings put away. Maybe we can lend you what you need. I was stunned into silence. Their generosity was overwhelming, almost unbelievable. I couldn't ask you to do that, I stammered. Your own family. You are our family, Evelyn, Sarah said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that suddenly felt cloying. After everything you've done for Leo over the years. It's the least we can do. We'll come over tomorrow and we'll talk through a plan. I went home that afternoon feeling a strange mix of profound gratitude and a deep, unsettling confusion. Their offer was a miracle, an answer to a prayer I had barely dared to whisper. But that look, that brief, unreadable glance they had shared, lingered in my mind. It was a discordant note in a symphony of kindness, a shadow that I couldn't quite chase away. The next evening, they came over as promised, but they didn't come alone. Leo, now a tall, handsome 18-year-old on the cusp of manhood, was with them. He gave me his usual warm hug, the scent of fresh air and sawdust clinging to his work shirt. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice the deep, rumbling tone of a man, so different from the childish treble I remembered. "We'll take care of you." We all sat in my living room, the room where Robert and I had spent so many happy evenings. Tom was the one who did the talking. He had a notepad and a pen, and he spoke with the rehearsed authority of a man who had practiced his lines. "Okay, Evelyn," he began, "Sarah and I have gone over everything. We can't give you the $50,000 in cash. Our savings aren't quite that deep, but we have another idea, one that works out better for everyone." He paused, looking at Sarah, then at Leo, as if for encouragement. "We propose to pay off the bank for you. We'll take out a loan ourselves and clear your debt completely. The house will be safe." The relief that washed over me was so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. "Oh, Tom, Sarah, I don't know what to say," I whispered. "How can I ever repay you?" "Well, that's the other part of the plan," Tom said, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. "We don't want you to have to worry about paying us back month by month. That's no way to live out your retirement, so we've drawn up a little agreement. It's very simple. We pay off the $50,000 debt, and in exchange, you sign over 40% of the house to us. It will all be official, drawn up by a lawyer. You get to live here for the rest of your life, worry-free, and we get our investment back when the house is eventually sold. It's a win-win." The cold knot of unease in my stomach tightened into a ball of ice. 40%. It was a huge chunk of my home, the only real asset I had in the world, but what choice did I have? 60 days. The bank's deadline echoed in my head. "It's a very generous offer," I said slowly, my mind racing. I need a little time to think about it." "Of course," Sarah said instantly. "But Evelyn, honey, don't think too long. The bank isn't going to wait. We're offering you a way out. A way to stay in your home." Her words were a velvet glove hiding an iron fist. It wasn't just an offer, it felt like a trap, one that had been carefully laid and baited. After they left, I sat in the dark for a long time. The house felt different. The familiar comfort of its walls had been replaced by a creeping sense of dread. Their solution was too neat, too perfect. And that look, it kept coming back to me. It was the look of prospectors who had just struck gold. It was not the look of sympathetic friends. I didn't sleep at all that night. My mind was a carousel of fear and suspicion. Why were they so eager to own a piece of my home? Why was Tom so prepared, with his notepad and his rehearsed speech? It felt less like a spontaneous act of kindness and more like the execution of a long-held plan. The next day was Sunday. And just as he had every Sunday for the last 10 years, Leo appeared on my doorstep. But this time, he wasn't carrying daisies or black-eyed Susans. In his hands was a single, perfect red rose. It was beautiful, but it felt wrong. It was too formal, too deliberate. The innocence of the gesture was gone. "A rose for my favorite lady," he said, but the easy smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Leo, can we talk for a minute?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I needed to understand. I needed to look into the eyes of the boy I had loved like a grandson and see the truth. We sat down at my kitchen table, the rose lying between us like a drop of blood on the white tablecloth. Your parents offer, it's very generous, I began, almost too generous. He wouldn't meet my gaze, he just stared at the rose, his jaw tight. They just want to help, Mrs. Gable. Do they, Leo? I pressed gently. Or is there something else going on, something you're not telling me? He remained silent, a muscle twitching in his cheek. I could see a war raging inside him. A war between loyalty to his parents and something else, something I prayed was affection for me. Leo, I said, my voice breaking. For 10 years, you have been a light in my life. Your flowers, they saved me from a loneliness so deep I thought I would never escape it. I always believed it was because you were a sweet, kind boy who cared about his lonely old neighbor. Was I wrong? Was it all a lie? That's when he finally looked at me. And in his sky-blue eyes, I saw not the kindness of a loving boy, but the deep, weary guilt of a long-term conspirator. The truth, when it came, was a quiet, devastating confession that dismantled my world piece by piece. The flowers weren't my idea, he said, his voice hoarse. Not at first. My parents told me to do it. They told me to bring you flowers every week to be your friend, to make you love me. The words hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. Why? I whispered, my heart shattering. Why would they do that? Leo took a deep breath, and the story he told me was darker and more tangled than I could have ever imagined. It was a story that had started long before he was born, a story of a secret debt, a bitter promise, and a decade of cold, calculated deception. It's because of your husband, Robert, he said, his eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed too old for his years. It's about the money he owed my grandfather. My grandfather's name was Frank Miller. He was a stonemason, the best in the county. He and your Robert were best friends, inseparable since they were boys. They did everything together. When Robert wanted to start his own construction business after the war, my grandfather was the one who loaned him the money to get started. It wasn't a small amount. It was everything he had saved. $10,000. That was a fortune back then. Robert promised to make him a full partner once the business was on its feet. He signed a promissory note, a simple piece of paper between friends, but it was a solemn promise. I watched Leo's face as he spoke, his features contorted with a pain that was not his own, a pain inherited through blood and bitterness. I tried to picture Robert, my kind, gentle Robert in this story, but the image wouldn't fit. The business took off, Leo continued, his voice low. Robert was good at what he did, but the partnership never happened, the money was never paid back. My grandfather would ask, gently at first. Robert always had an excuse. The business needed a new truck. A client was late on a payment. The economy was bad. The excuses went on for years. He paused, swallowing hard. Then, my grandfather had an accident on a job site. A wall collapsed. It crushed his leg. He could never work again. He was desperate. He went to Robert, not as a partner, but as a friend in need, begging for the money he was owed. Robert gave him $200 and told him it was all he could spare. A wave of nausea washed over me. I wanted to scream that it was a lie, that Robert would never have done such a thing, but a long-forgotten memory flickered in the back of my mind. An argument, late one night. I had woken to the sound of raised voices. Robert and another man in the living room. The man's voice was full of a desperate pleading I didn't understand. The next day, Robert was quiet, withdrawn. He told me an old friend had come asking for a handout, that he was a gambling man who had fallen on hard times. I had believed him without question. I had always believed him. My grandfather died a year later, Leo said, his voice flat. My father, Tom, was just a boy. He always said Grandpa died of a broken heart just as much as he died from his injuries. He left my father nothing but that promissory note from Robert and a lifetime of resentment. He made my father promise he would one day get back what was stolen from our family. Not just the money, but our honor. So that was it, the root of it all, not friendship, but a festering, decades-old grudge. My neighbors hadn't been kind, they had been patient. They had been vultures, circling, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When we moved in next door 10 years ago, it wasn't an accident, Leo confessed, the words tumbling out of him now. My dad saw the house was for sale. He knew it was Robert Gable's house. He bought it for a song because the market was down. He said it was fate. He said it was our chance to make things right. make things right. I repeated, my voice dripping with a scorn I didn't know I possessed. You mean a chance to take my home. At first, the plan was simple, he said, ignoring my question. He was just going to come over and show you the promissory note demand payment. But then he saw you. You were so sad after Robert died. So alone, he said a direct confrontation would be too messy. You'd get a lawyer, and the note was so old it might not even hold up in court. So he came up with a new plan, a longer plan, a better plan. The flowers, the weekly visits, my heart seized in my chest. He told me to become your friend, Leo whispered, his gaze finally dropping to the floor in shame. He said, make her trust you, son. Make her see you as family. So when the time is right, she'll turn to us, not to a stranger. For 10 years, my life had been a stage play, and I was the only one who didn't know it. Every kind word, every shared cup of tea, every story I had told them about my life had been cataloged, analyzed, and filed away for future use. They were waiting for me to become vulnerable, and Robert's secret mortgage had handed them the perfect weapon. The $50,000 you owe the bank, Leo said, his voice barely audible. My dad says it's justice. The original $10,000 my grandfather loaned Robert, with interest compounded over 40 years. It comes to almost exactly $50,000. The sheer, diabolical precision of it stole my breath. This wasn't a rescue. It was a foreclosure of a different kind, a meticulously planned collection on a debt I never knew existed. The 40% they wanted wasn't a random number. It was the price of my husband's sin. They weren't just taking my house. They were settling a score, using me as the final pawn in a game that had started before I was even a part of it. And you, Leo? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. You went along with this for 10 years. You watched me, you listened to me, you let me love you, all the while knowing what your parents were planning. Tears welled in his eyes, real tears this time. I was just a kid when it started. It was a game. My dad told me I was helping our family, but as I got older, I hated it. I told them it was wrong. But my dad, he gets this look in his eyes when he talks about his father. It's a fire that never goes out. He said this was bigger than you or me. It was about his father's honor. Honor. I spat the word out like it was poison. There is no honor in this, Leo. This is theft, plain and simple. It is cruel and it is evil. I stood up from the table, my body trembling with a rage so pure and so cold it felt like ice water in my veins. Get out of my house, I said. Leo, please, Mrs. Gable, get out. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, raw and ragged. And take your blood-red rose with you. He flinched as if I had struck him. He stood slowly, his face a mask of misery, and walked to the door. He didn't take the rose. He left it on the table, a silent, mocking testament to a decade of lies. As the door clicked shut behind him, the rage that had been holding me up seemed to evaporate, leaving me weak and hollow. I sank back into my chair and stared at my hands. They were the hands of an old woman, wrinkled, spotted, and frail. But as I looked at them, a new feeling began to smolder in the pit of my stomach. It was the embers of my anger, glowing hot and fierce. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. They had mistaken my loneliness for stupidity. They had seen a frail old widow, an easy target. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The next morning, I didn't cry. I got organized. I found a box in the attic and began filling it with every document I could find related to my finances and the house. The deed, Robert's will, my bank statements, and the terrifying letter from the bank. I then went to my bookshelf and pulled out the large photo album, the one titled Our Life. I flipped through the pages, past the smiling photos of Robert and me on our wedding day, on vacations, at Christmas parties. I was looking for a specific time, the period right after Robert started his business. And there it was. A photo of Robert and another man, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, standing proudly in front of a half-finished building. The other man was broad-shouldered with a kind, open face. Underneath the photo, in my own handwriting, were the words, Robert and his best man, Frank Miller, 1975. Leo hadn't been lying. Frank Miller was real. He had been a part of our lives. Seeing his face, seeing his genuine smile, made the betrayal feel even sharper. Robert had not just cheated a business partner, he had betrayed his best friend. The knowledge settled in my heart like a stone, a heavy, painful weight of disappointment in the man I had loved for half a century. But my grief was a luxury I couldn't afford. It was fuel now. I called the local bar association and asked for a recommendation for a lawyer specializing in property law and elder abuse. They gave me a name, Mr. Peterson. I made an appointment for that afternoon. I walked into Mr. Peterson's office feeling like a soldier heading into battle. He was a man in his 60s, with a calm, reassuring demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I didn't weep or waver. I laid out the whole story, from the bank's letter to Leo's confession, with cold, clear precision. I showed him the photo of Robert and Frank. I even placed the single red rose, now slightly wilted, on his desk. "They've been playing a very long game, Mrs. Gable," he said when I had finished. His voice was grim. "And a very clever one. Their offer to pay the bank in exchange for a percentage of the house is designed to look like an act of charity. It would be very difficult to prove in court that it was premeditated. So, they're going to get away with it." I asked, a sliver of my carefully constructed composure cracking. "They're going to steal my home?" "Not if I can help it," he said, a determined glint in his eye. "Their plan has a weakness. They are relying on you being too scared and too desperate to do anything but accept their generous offer. They don't expect you to fight back. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We are going to call their bluff." His plan was simple but brilliant. First, he would contact the bank and negotiate an extension on the 60-day deadline. "Banks don't want to foreclose on elderly widows, Mrs. Gable. It's bad publicity. I'm confident I can get you more time." Second, and this was the crucial part, he would have the house officially appraised. "What did you say your neighbors offered you?" he asked. "They offered to pay the $50,000 debt in exchange for 40% of the house," I replied. Mr. Peterson leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "And what would you say your house is worth, Mrs. Gable?" I thought for a moment. "I don't know, it's an old house. Maybe 200,000, maybe a little more." Mr. Peterson smiled faintly. "I suspect you are underestimating its value. This town has grown a lot in the last 40 years. That land you're on, a double lot with mature trees so close to the new school, I think you might be in for a surprise. If their 40% is based on an assumed value that is far lower than the reality, then their deal starts to look a lot less like a rescue and a lot more like outright fraud." A flicker of hope ignited within me. "What do I do in the meantime?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "You go home, you act normal. When your neighbors ask about their offer, you tell them you are still considering it, that you are grateful, but it's a big decision. Let them think their plan is working. Let them think you are the frightened little bird they believe you to be. The last thing we want is for them to know that you are talking to a lawyer." I left his office feeling a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in years. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in control. I had a plan, I had an ally, and I had a weapon they had never counted on: the truth. When I got home, I saw Sarah in her garden, pretending to pull weeds but really watching my house. When she saw my car, she straightened up and gave me a brilliant, false smile, waving enthusiastically. I took a deep breath, composed my features into a mask of weary gratitude, and walked over. "Evelyn, I was so worried. We didn't hear from you. Did you think about our offer?" she asked, her voice laced with that same cloying sweetness. "I have, Sarah," I said, my voice carefully pitched to sound fragile and overwhelmed. It's so generous. I'm just so confused by it all." "It's such a big decision." "Of course it is, dear," she said, patting my arm. Her touch felt like a spider on my skin. "You just take your time, but not too much time, remember. That bank won't wait forever." "I know," I said, letting my shoulders slump in defeat. "I'll let you know in a day or two." I turned and walked back to my house, feeling her eyes on my back the entire way. I knew she was smiling, convinced that her family's 40-year-old vendetta was about to pay off. She had no idea that the game had changed. The pawn she thought she was about to take off the board had just been promoted to a queen. The appraiser came 2 days later. He was a quiet, professional man who spent hours measuring every room, tapping on walls, and making notes on a clipboard. Tom and Sarah watched his arrival from their window, their curiosity palpable. I'm sure they thought I was getting the house valued for insurance purposes, never suspecting the real reason. The official report arrived in the mail a week later. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Leo had confessed his family's sins, and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Mr. Peterson was right. I had been in for a surprise. The house itself was valued at $150,000, but the land, the double lot in a rapidly developing area, was worth over $300,000. The total estimated value of my property was $475,000. I did the math. 40% of that was $190,000. Tom and Sarah had offered to pay a $50,000 debt in exchange for a stake in my home worth almost 4 times that amount. It was a predatory, monstrous, and legally fraudulent deal. And now, I had the proof. Armed with the appraisal, I was ready for the next move. I called Tom and Sarah and asked them to come over that evening to finalize the details of our arrangement. I could hear the triumphant glee in Sarah's voice over the phone. They arrived at my door at 7 o'clock sharp, carrying a briefcase. They looked like a pair of undertakers who had come to measure a corpse. "Evelyn, we are so glad you've come to your senses," Tom said as he sat down on my sofa, placing the briefcase on the coffee table with a smug thud. "We have the paperwork right here. Our lawyer drew it up. It's all very standard." "I have a few questions before I sign anything," I said, my voice calm and steady. Sarah's smile tightened just a fraction. "Of course, dear. What is it?" I slid the official appraisal across the coffee table toward them. "I was just curious," I said, my eyes locking with Tom's. "Did you know my property was worth nearly $500,000 when you offered to take a 40% share for $50,000? The change in the room was instantaneous. The air crackled with a tension so thick I could taste it. Tom's face, which had been a mask of false sympathy, turned to stone. The blood drained from Sarah's cheeks, leaving her face a pale, pasty white. They stared at the number on the paper as if it were a venomous snake. "Where did you get this?" Tom finally asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I had the property appraised," I said simply. I thought it would be a sensible thing to do before signing away almost half of it. "Don't you agree?" Sarah found her voice first, a high-pitched, frantic sound. "That's a mistake. There's no way this old place is worth that much. It's an inflated number." "It's a legally certified appraisal from the best firm in the state," I replied, my voice as cold as ice. "Your little plan was very clever, Tom. The story about your father, the 40 years of waiting, the poetic justice of the $50,000 debt. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. But you got greedy. You assumed I was a foolish old woman who would be so scared and grateful that she wouldn't ask any questions. You thought you could steal $190,000 from me and call it honor." Tom stood up, his large frame looming over me. For a moment, I saw a flicker of real violence in his eyes, the same fire Leo had described. "You listened to me, you old witch," he snarled. "Your husband was a thief who stole my father's future. We are owed what is ours." "Your father was owed $10,000, I shot back, standing to face him, my fear gone, replaced by a righteous fury. "And perhaps he was, but that debt was with Robert, not with me. And it does not give you the right to defraud me, to manipulate me, and to try and steal my home from under my feet through lies and deception." The front door opened, and Leo stood there. He had obviously been listening from the porch. His face was pale, and he looked from his parents' enraged faces to my defiant one. "Dad, stop it," he said, his voice pleading. "She's right." "This is wrong. You stay out of this, boy," Tom roared, turning on his son. "This is family business. She is my family, too." Leo yelled back, his voice cracking with emotion. "For 10 years, you made me lie to her. You made me use her. I won't let you bully her anymore." In that moment, watching the boy I had known for a decade stand up to his father for me, something inside me shifted. The rage remained, but a sliver of something else broke through. A glimmer of the boy with the daisies, the boy I had loved. But this was not the time for sentiment. This was the time for the final move. "I think you should both leave my house now," I said, my voice ringing with an authority they had never heard from me before. "We're not going anywhere until you agree to what is fair." Sarah shrieked, her composure completely shattered. "Fine," I said, picking up my phone from the end table. "Then I'll just call the police and we can explain the whole situation to them. I'm sure they'll be very interested in this appraisal and in the concept of attempted fraud against a senior citizen." That was the word that did it. Fraud. It was a legal term, a criminal term. It meant consequences beyond just not getting what they wanted. Tom and Sarah froze, their faces a mixture of fury and, for the first time, real fear. They looked at each other, another one of their silent conversations passing between them. But this time, it was a conversation of defeat. Tom snatched the briefcase from the table. "This isn't over," he hissed, but the threat was hollow. There was no fire in his eyes now, only the bitter ash of failure. He stormed out of the house, Sarah scrambling to follow him. Leo remained in the doorway, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading sorrow. "Mrs. Gable, I am so sorry," he whispered. I looked at him, the instrument of their deception, the symbol of my deepest betrayal. "I know, Leo," I said, and my voice was just tired. "Now please go." He left, closing the door softly behind him. And I was alone again in my house, surrounded by a silence that was different from the one Robert had left behind. This was not a silence of loss. It was a silence of victory. It was the sound of a trap being sprung, but not on me. I had won the battle, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the war was far from over. I still had a $50,000 debt hanging over my head, and I had just made a mortal enemy of the man who lived right next door. The days that followed were a new kind of quiet. The silence in my house was no longer one of grief, but of vigilance. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside my window, made me jump. I lived on a war footing, my home a fortress, my neighbor the enemy. I had won the first major battle, but the $50,000 sword was still hanging over my head, and I knew Tom and Sarah were not the kind of people to accept defeat. They were merely regrouping, planning their next assault. Their retaliation began not with a bang, but with a quiet, vicious act of cruelty. I woke up one morning to find my prize-winning rose bushes, the ones I had nurtured for 20 years, the ones that had won me 3 blue ribbons at the county fair, hacked to pieces. The blooms, just on the verge of opening, lay scattered across my lawn like fallen soldiers. The stems were mangled, shredded with a fury that went beyond simple vandalism. It was an act of pure, distilled hatred. I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. I simply took out my camera, the one Mr. Peterson had advised me to buy, and documented every single broken stem, every ruined bud. I photographed the footprints in the soft earth of the flower bed, large prints that matched the work boots Tom always wore. It was circumstantial evidence, but it was a start. The psychological warfare escalated. They began leaving their trash cans directly in front of my walkway. They would play loud, jarring music late into the night, the bass thumping through my walls, making sleep impossible. They installed a powerful floodlight on the side of their house, aimed directly at my bedroom window, bathing my room in a harsh, industrial glare all night long. Each act was small enough to be deniable, to be passed off as thoughtlessness rather than malice. But I knew better. This was a siege, a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts designed to wear me down, to make my life in my own home so unbearable that I would eventually break and run. But I was not the same woman I had been a few weeks ago. I was no longer a wilting flower. I was a rock, weathered and worn, but utterly, stubbornly immovable. I documented everything. I kept a logbook, noting the date, the time, and the nature of each incident. I bought blackout curtains for my bedroom. I wore earplugs to bed. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I met with Mr. Peterson again, showing him the photos of my ruined roses and my meticulous logbook. He shook his head, his expression grim. "This is a classic campaign of harassment, Evelyn," he said. "We can file for a restraining order, but it can be difficult to get a judge to act on these kinds of nuisance issues unless there's a direct threat." "He threatened me," I said, remembering the look in Tom's eyes during our confrontation. I felt it. Feeling it and proving it are two different things, unfortunately. he said gently. For now, keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. Do not engage with them. Your composure is your greatest weapon. Now, let's talk about the more pressing issue. The bank. He explained that he had secured me a 90-day extension, but the clock was ticking. We have a few options, he said. We could try to sell a portion of your land. The appraisal shows it's valuable, but that could get complicated with zoning laws, and it takes time we don't have. He leaned forward, his expression serious. There is another option, one that many people in your situation consider, a reverse mortgage. He explained the process in simple, clear terms. The bank would essentially pay me, either in a lump sum or in monthly installments, using the equity in my home as collateral. The loan wouldn't have to be paid back until I either sold the house or passed away. It would give me the $50,000 I needed immediately and provide me with a financial cushion for the rest of my life. The downside, he cautioned, is that the interest accrues over time and the bank will eventually own a larger and larger piece of your home. It's not the right choice for everyone, but it would solve your immediate problem and allow you to stay in your house. I felt a familiar sense of dread. After fighting so hard to keep Tom and Sarah from taking a piece of my home, the idea of voluntarily giving a piece of it to the bank felt like a different kind of defeat. It felt like I was trading one predator for another. I need to think about it, I told him, and he understood. That afternoon, my friend Clara, a fellow member of the gardening club, came over. She gasped when she saw the carnage in my rose garden. Her outrage on my behalf was a soothing balm on my frayed nerves. We sat at my kitchen table, and I told her everything, including Mr. Peterson's suggestion of a reverse mortgage. "Oh, Evelyn, be so careful with that," she warned, her kind face creased with worry. "My brother-in-law did that. It solved his money problems, yes, but he said he never felt like he owned his own home again. He said it felt like he was just renting his own memories from the bank." Her words echoed my own fears. The house was more than just an asset to me. It was a living thing, filled with the echoes of my life with Robert. It was the last piece of him I had left. The thought of a bank slowly devouring it from the inside out was sickening. The harassment from next door continued, a constant, grinding pressure. One evening, as I was washing the dishes, I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye. Leo was standing at the edge of my property, just beyond the row of butchered rose bushes. He didn't approach the house. He just stood there, watching me through the window, his face a portrait of misery. I dropped the dish towel and went to the back door, opening it just a crack. "What do you want, Leo?" I asked, my voice devoid of warmth. He took a hesitant step forward. "I wanted to see if you were okay," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Your roses, I heard my dad bragging about it. I'm so sorry." "Sorrow doesn't fix a 20-year-old rose bush, Leo," I said, my voice hard. "He's out of control," Leo whispered, his voice desperate. "He's so angry he lost, he's not thinking straight. He sits up all night, looking at your house, trying to think of new ways to hurt you." The boy's fear was palpable, and for a moment, I saw past the conspirator and saw a child trapped in a nightmare he didn't create. "You need to be careful, Mrs. Gable," he said, finally looking up at me. "He's talking to a lawyer. He's trying to find another way. He won't stop." He turned and walked away before I could respond, disappearing into the deepening twilight. His warning, as much as his apology, lingered in the air. Tom was looking for another way. He wasn't just trying to drive me out through harassment. He was actively searching for a new legal weapon to use against me. The next morning, I noticed that the third step on my back porch, which had been loose for years, was now firm and solid. A new piece of wood had been expertly fitted into place, the nail heads countersunk and puttied over. It was the work of a skilled carpenter. It was Leo's work. He had come back in the night, after his warning, and offered a silent, tangible apology, the only way he knew how. He had fixed what was broken. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. It told me that the boy I had known was still in there, fighting against the poison his father had fed him. I was still angry, still wounded by the years of deceit, but for the first time, a flicker of something else, a complicated and unwelcome seed of pity, began to take root in my heart. A week later, Tom found his new weapon. I came home from the grocery store to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. It was an official violation notice from the city's code enforcement department. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the list of infractions. Overgrown hedges in violation of a city ordinance. A crack in the public sidewalk bordering my property that was deemed a tripping hazard. Peeling paint on my window frames that violated the neighborhood's historical preservation code. The list went on. I was being ordered to rectify all violations within 30 days or face a fine of $500 a day. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts. The repairs would cost thousands of dollars I didn't have. It was Tom's checkmate. He couldn't take my house through fraud, so now he was using the city's own rules to bury me in fines and debt until I would be forced to sell. I sank down onto my porch steps, the orange notice crinkling in my hand. The floodlight, the loud music, the ruined roses. All of that was just a smokescreen. This was the real attack. It was insidious, impersonal, and utterly, terrifyingly effective. He had found a way to turn my own home into a weapon against me, and this time I had no idea how I was going to fight back. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a wave of true despair wash over me. I was tired. I was a 72-year-old woman, and I was so tired of fighting. I looked over at their house, at the pristine lawn and the perfectly maintained flower beds. They had made their home a fortress, while methodically turning mine into a ruin. And as I sat there, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me, I saw the curtain in their living room window twitch. They were watching me, savoring this moment, waiting for me to finally crumble. That night, sleep was impossible. The city's violation notice lay on my bedside table, a glowing orange harbinger of my defeat. Every option I had felt like a dead end. The reverse mortgage felt like a slow surrender, a capitulation to the bank instead of my neighbors. Selling the house was an outright defeat, giving Tom and Sarah exactly what they had wanted from the beginning. My mind raced in circles, searching for a third option, a hidden path that I couldn't see. My thoughts kept drifting back to Robert. It was his secret, his sin, that had planted the seed of this whole nightmare. I felt a fresh wave of anger towards him, a bitter resentment that he had left me to fight a battle he had started. I got out of bed and went to the old roll-top desk in the spare room, the one Robert had used as his office. I hadn't touched it in years. It was filled with his old papers, blueprints, and business records. I never had the heart to clean it out. It felt like erasing him, but now I opened it with a grim determination. I wasn't looking for memories. I was looking for answers. For hours, I sifted through dusty files, old invoices, and faded ledgers from his construction business. It was a history of a man's life, written in numbers and contracts. Most of it was meaningless to me. But then, tucked away in a small, locked metal box at the back of the bottom drawer, I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a thick file folder, and on the tab in Robert's familiar scrawl was a single word: Miller. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside wasn't just the promissory note Leo had told me about. It was there, a simple, handwritten IOU for $10,000, signed by Robert and dated 1974. But there was more. There were letters, dozens of them. Letters from Frank Miller to Robert, written over a period of 15 years. The early ones were full of hope and friendship, discussing their plans for the business, their shared dreams of building an empire together. Then the tone began to change. The letters became more desperate, pleading for the money he was owed, describing his financial troubles, his accident, his inability to work. They were a heartbreaking chronicle of a man's slow descent into despair. But it was Robert's unsent replies that shattered me. Tucked behind each of Frank's letters was a carbon copy of a letter Robert had written, but apparently never had the courage to mail. They were filled with anguish and shame. He confessed that he had mismanaged the company's early finances, that he had made a series of bad investments trying to grow the business too quickly. The $10,000 was long gone, and he was too proud and too ashamed to admit to his best friend that he had lost everything. He had chosen to save face, to maintain the illusion of success, even if it meant sacrificing his friendship and his honor. He had given Frank a paltry $200 not because he was cruel, but because he was a coward. He was broke, and he was ashamed. The last thing in the folder was a formal-looking document. It was a legally registered business partnership agreement. It made Frank Miller a 40% silent partner in Gable Construction, a stake that was to be held in trust for him and his heirs, to be paid out upon the sale of the business or the death of Robert Gable. It was dated 1978, 4 years after the original loan. It was Robert's attempt to make things right, a legal confession of his debt and his partnership. But like the letters, it had never been sent. It was signed only by him. It had been sitting in this box, a silent, gathering dust for over 40 years, a testament to a promise made but never fulfilled. Tears streamed down my face as I read it. They were tears of sorrow for Frank, tears of pity for the weak, frightened man my husband had been, and tears of a strange, burgeoning hope. This document, this forgotten piece of paper, changed everything. Tom and Sarah's claim wasn't just a bitter grudge, it was a legitimate legal inheritance. They were owed 40%, but not of my house. They were owed 40% of Gable Construction. I sat there for a long time, the papers spread out before me, a ghost story playing out in my husband's own words. The city's violation notice, the $50,000 debt, Tom's campaign of terror, it all suddenly seemed secondary. I had stumbled upon the heart of the matter, the original sin. And I realized there was only one way to end this war. It wasn't to fight back with more lawyers and more restraining orders. It was to finally, after 40 years, honor the promise my husband had been too ashamed to keep. The next morning, I didn't call Mr. Peterson. This was something I had to do myself. With the Miller file clutched in my hand, I walked across the lawn, my steps sure and steady. I ignored the trampled rose bushes and the glare of the floodlight. I knocked on their door. Tom answered, his face instantly hardening into a mask of contempt when he saw me. "What do you want?" he snarled. "We have nothing to talk about. The city will be dealing with you now." "I think you'll want to see this," I said, my voice even. I pushed past him into their living room. Sarah was on the sofa, a smug, triumphant look on her face. The look vanished when she saw the expression on my face and the old, worn folder in my hand. "I was going through my husband's old business papers last night," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that commanded their attention. "And I found something that belongs to your family." I opened the folder on their coffee table, the same table where they had planned to defraud me. I laid out the promissory note. Then I laid out the letters, Frank's desperate pleas and Robert's shame-filled, unsent replies. I watched their faces as they read the words of the fathers they had both mythologized. Tom's hands were shaking. Sarah was as white as a sheet. Finally, I placed the last document on the table, the partnership agreement. "My husband was a coward," I said, my voice thick with a sorrow that was 40 years old. "He was ashamed, and he let his pride destroy his friendship with your father. He owed him this. He owed him 40% of his business. It seems, Tom, that you were right all along. Your family is owed a debt, but you've been trying to collect it from the wrong place." Tom stared at the partnership agreement, his eyes tracing the lines of Robert's signature. He picked it up as if it might burn him. The story he had been told his whole life, the story of a malicious thief, was being rewritten before his eyes. His father's enemy was not a monster, just a flawed, frightened man. "Gable Construction was dissolved when Robert died," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's worthless." "Is it?" I asked. "Robert sold off most of the equipment before he passed. But the business still owned one asset, a piece of undeveloped commercial land out by the old highway. He bought it in the 70s, thinking the town would expand that way. It never did. He told me it was a worthless piece of swamp. He never even bothered to sell it." A new light was dawning in Tom's eyes, a flicker of something beyond his inherited rage. "I had it appraised last year for tax purposes," I said, delivering the final, decisive blow. "The new interstate exit is going in half a mile from it. A developer has been trying to buy it from me for months. They've offered $250,000. I let the number hang in the air. 40% of that," I said quietly, "is $100,000. It's more than enough to pay off my bank debt and give you what you are owed." It is the honorable settlement that should have happened 40 years ago. Silence descended on the room. Sarah was openly weeping now, not tears of rage or frustration, but of a profound, soul-shaking shock. Tom just stared at the papers, his whole world, his whole life's purpose turned completely upside down. The villain he had built his life around hating was just a man. The honor he was fighting for was not a matter of vengeance, but of a simple, forgotten business contract. Outside, the sun was beginning to break through the gray morning clouds. It felt like a truce. The long, bitter war, passed down from one generation to the next, was finally over. The question was, what would rise from the ashes? The silence in that small living room stretched for what felt like an eternity. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of two fathers, of a broken friendship, of a lifetime of bitterness that had been built on a foundation of incomplete truths. Tom finally looked up from the papers, his eyes meeting mine. The fire of his rage had been extinguished, and in its place was a vast, bewildered emptiness. All this time, he whispered, more to himself than to me. All this time, he was just ashamed. He looked at the letters from his own father, and for the first time, he wasn't just seeing a victim's pleas. He was seeing the words of a man who was losing his best friend and didn't understand why. Sarah, through her tears, looked at me. We had no idea, she stammered. We thought he cheated him. We thought he did it on purpose. He did cheat him, I said, my voice firm but without the sharp edge of anger it had held before. He cheated him out of a friendship, out of honesty, out of the respect he was due. He let your father die thinking he had been cast aside by a man he trusted. That, I think, was the greater theft. The money was just paper. I stood up. The righteous fury that had sustained me for weeks had been replaced by a profound weariness. The developer's offer is on the table, I said. I will instruct my lawyer to draft a settlement. You will get your 40%, as stipulated in this agreement. From that, you will pay the $50,000 owed on my house, as per your original offer. The rest is yours, the inheritance your father was denied. In return, the harassment stops. The city violation notices are withdrawn. You will leave me to live in peace. I didn't wait for an answer. I turned and walked out of their house, leaving the ghosts and the documents behind for them to reckon with. As I crossed the lawn, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close to it. It was the feeling of a great, heavy chain, one that had been wrapped around my life without my knowledge, finally falling away. The next day, Mr. Peterson received a call from Tom's lawyer. The tone was no longer aggressive, but conciliatory. They accepted the terms of the settlement without negotiation. A week later, another call came, this one from the city's code enforcement office. All violation notices against my property had been officially withdrawn, the complaints rescinded by the original filer. The loud music stopped. The floodlight was turned off. The trash cans were moved back to their proper place. The siege was over. The silence that settled between our two houses was different now. It was not the tense, watchful silence of a ceasefire, but the awkward, uncertain silence that follows a great reckoning. We were no longer enemies, but we were not yet neighbors. We were two families, bound by a complicated and painful history, trying to figure out what came next. A few weeks later, after the sale of the land had gone through and all the debts had been paid, there was a knock on my door. It was Leo. He wasn't carrying flowers. In his hands, he held a small, newly potted rose bush. It was a peace rose, its buds a delicate blend of yellow and pink. I know it won't replace the ones you lost, he said, his eyes downcast. But I thought maybe we could plan it together. I looked at the young man standing on my porch, a man who had been both my tormentor and my savior. I saw the guilt he still carried, but I also saw the genuine goodness that had been fighting to get out. I would like that very much, Leo, I said, and for the first time in a long time, my smile felt real. We spent the afternoon in my garden, digging in the rich soil under the warm autumn sun. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't need to. We talked about his plans for college, about the books I was reading, about the proper way to prune a rose bush. As we worked, Tom came out of his house. He stood at the edge of his lawn, watching us for a long time. I could see the conflict on his face. Finally, he walked over, stopping at the property line, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Those old bushes," he said, his voice rough. "They were beautiful. I'm sorry, Evelyn. It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a simple, honest admission of regret. It was a start." "Yes, they were," I said, looking him in the eye. "But this one will be beautiful too. It just needs time." He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew I wasn't just talking about the roses. He turned and went back to his house without another word. Over the next few months, things slowly began to thaw. Sarah would wave to me when I got my mail, a hesitant, shy gesture that I would return. Tom began to mow the strip of grass between our houses again, something he hadn't done since the fighting began. They were small things, tiny acts of contrition, but they were the beginnings of a new kind of peace, one built not on a lie, but on a difficult and painful truth. Leo continued to visit, not every Sunday, but often. He never brought flowers again. Instead, he brought his time. He helped me with chores around the house, fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen, cleaning out my gutters, things Robert used to do. He would sit with me on the porch, and we would talk for hours. He was rebuilding the bridge he had been forced to help burn down, one conversation, one act of kindness at a time. I never loved him in the same innocent way I had before. The trust was different now, tempered by the knowledge of the past. But in its place was a new kind of affection, one that was deeper and more resilient, an affection that had been tested by fire and had, improbably, survived. One day, I found an old, faded photograph in a drawer. It was the one of Robert and Frank Miller, their arms around each other, two young men full of dreams, standing in front of their first big project. I put it in a simple frame and walked over to Tom's house. I gave it to him without a word. He took it, his big, calloused hands gentle as they held the frame. He looked at the photo of the father he had only known as a broken, bitter man and saw him as he once was, happy, strong, and standing beside his best friend. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. And I knew that the debt, the real debt of honor and friendship, had finally, truly been paid. My name is Evelyn Gable. I'm 72 years old, and I live in a house that is entirely my own, surrounded by a garden that is slowly beginning to bloom again. I have learned that the past is never truly gone. Its ghosts live in old letters and forgotten promises, and its debts can be passed down through generations. But I have also learned that even the most bitter roots can, with time and a great deal of courage, produce the most unexpected blossoms. The neighbor's boy no longer brings me flowers. He brings me something far more valuable, the quiet, steady gift of a friendship that we both chose, a friendship that we earned. And some days, when the light is just right and a gentle breeze rustles the leaves of the new rose bush, that feels like the purest, most innocent gesture I have ever known. If you enjoyed this story and would like to see more content like this, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Mama Lottie Stories. Your support helps us continue to bring these narratives to life. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in my situation? Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again for our next story.